Hello, everyone, and welcome to the panel Mobilizing for Climate. It is an absolute pleasure to be addressing you all today. We all have one thing in common. We are chronically aware of the climate crisis. Yet how do we unite to turn these thoughts into tangible action, mobilizing ourselves and our community? To promote climate action, many multi-stakeholder commitments and partnerships have been created. One of the most broadcast and well-known is the Paris Agreement. However, despite such commitments, today, in 2023, keeping the global temperature rise to 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial levels is still an immense struggle. Thus, we ask ourselves, why did global carbon dioxide emissions hit a record high last year? Today, we are here to rethink our approach to fighting climate change, figuring out how different stakeholders can collaborate to fight the climate crisis efficiently and with purpose. Our aim is to discuss the question, what concrete steps are needed for coordinated global climate action? My name is Victoria Puype. I am a student at the International School of Zug in Lucerne, and I will be moderating this panel. Now, without further ado, it is an honor to introduce you to our celebrated speakers joining us today. Firstly, I would like to welcome Reto Knutti. Reto is a climate scientist and professor of climate physics at ETH Zurich's Institute for Atmospheric and Climate Science. He has conducted extensive research regarding climate models, the 2-degree target, and natural climate variability, contributing to a better understanding of the uncertainties in climate projections. Furthermore, I would like to introduce Namgay Choden. Namgay has championed climate action and breaking barriers to youth participation in decision-making through her work in the Bhutanese government, that included being an Article 6 negotiator at the COP27. It is also an honor to introduce Mr. Jim Snabe, who is the chairman of Siemens, an incoming chairman at Northvolt, a green battery developer, and on the board of the World Economic Forum. He is the former co-CEO of SAP and teaches at the Copenhagen Business School in the fields of leadership, responsible business, and change management as an adjunct professor. Moreover, it is an honor to introduce Virginijus Sinkevicius, who has been the European Commissioner for Environment, Oceans, and Fisheries since 2019, leading work linked to nature, pollution, oceans, and the circular economy. Lastly, I would like to welcome Jane Burston, who is the Clean Air Fund's founding executive director and a WEF Young Global Leader. The Clean Air Fund is a philanthropic organization dedicated to creating a future where everyone breathes clean air, granting over $20 million a year to air pollution reduction activity. This session will start with an insightful discussion between our panelists and will be followed by a 15-minute Q&A session led by you, the audience. I would like to incite your support in promoting this session and the Open Forum Davos on social media, sharing your experience and takeaways using the hashtag OpenForum23 and hashtag WEF23. On that note, let us start this discussion. You have heard me repeat the words climate action multiple times already. Therefore, I would like to begin by asking the panel what efficient climate action can look like or has looked like for them. Namgay, could you begin?
Oh, I wasn't expecting that. Thank you, Victoria. Hello, everybody. It's really a pleasure to be here. I am Namgay Choden. I'm from Bhutan, and I suppose many of you have not heard of where Bhutan is. It's a small country right in between India and China. Bhutan is also a least developed country, but my country has had an amazing track record in terms of being pro-climate. Most notably, Bhutan was the first climate negative country in the world, which means that it sequesters more carbon dioxide than it emits. I was working in the Bhutanese government as a foreign service officer, and my career concluded on a high note where I was at the COP27 as a negotiator. After that, I decided to leave the government to pursue my own venture, where I provide ecosystem support services and also accelerated partnerships for the climate negotiators team in terms of fundraising and also providing larger technical support. I am here at Davos as part of the 53-person delegation called the Davos 50 from the Global Shapers community, which really is an offshoot of the World Economic Forum to enable young people to self-organize and positively impact their communities. So what is efficient climate action for me? As somebody who has been in government and as someone who's young, I'm 26, I'm far older than you, but still, I call myself young. For me, climate action is, I believe, essentially a matter of civic engagement. While not negating individual action, I really truly believe that transformational and lasting change can only be achieved if you're able to influence policy. And therefore, I have a couple of key messages today around being engaged in public life, which is something that a lot of you can and really must consider, and also around building linkages and intergenerational allyships, because you're all going to go out there and you're going to be working across different sectors, but also with many, many different people with very different mindsets and perspectives, and how you can build linkages and provide constructive criticism and create constructive conversations. So I'll keep it at here. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Namgay, for your insightful remarks, and I hope we'll be able to hear more about the inspiring work you've done throughout this panel. Reto, would you like to share your thoughts on what climate action is to you?
So the science has basically concluded quite a long time ago that the Paris targets require net zero greenhouse gas or CO2 emissions, that basically we cannot afford to burn fossil fuels any longer. It's as simple as that, so get rid of fossil fuels. How to do that, I'm not sure. So if you say what's effective climate action, I think honestly we're struggling. But maybe we can say something about the elements that could be part of that. And I think the elements, there are essentially three. We need some political boundary conditions, frameworks, right? You cannot do it all with individual responsibilities. In all historic environmental problems, be it air pollution, waste, whatever, we have never succeeded in solving those with individual action alone. So it needs some political boundary framework. It needs innovation and technology. I think we're pretty much there. No, we don't have everything, but we have a lot on that. And then it needs stories and visions and leadership. So how do you get from knowing what the problem is and knowing what the solution is to actually implementing the solution? And I think that's where the biggest struggle is. The economist Kahneman once said, nobody ever made a decision because of a number, they need a story. And I think it's up to us to sort of create those stories and those common visions of where we want to go.
Thank you so much, Reto. I think your point of view as a scientist is really appreciated. You mentioned political framework. I therefore turn to you, Virginijus. You have been working with the European Commission for over 3 years now. What are some of the policies or strategies implemented by the European Commission that have mobilized the most climate action, and why?
Yes, good afternoon to everyone, and thank you very much for having me. And thank you for filling up the room. It's always a great pleasure to speak to the room full of people who are really engaged. And to begin with, I will follow up a bit on the previous question as regards the climate action, because I think we're meeting at a very good time, where I finally see the picture of actions needed complete. Because I found it very weird that we always concentrate, when we speak about the climate action, we speak about only greenhouse gas emissions, about the CO2, and we forget ecosystems. Because without functioning ecosystems, what our oceans can do for us, our forests, peats, and so on, we still have no chances of succeeding, even so if we will decarbonize our economies. So we had an extremely successful meeting in Montreal Kunming Agreement on COP15, where we finally now have, I would say, picture complete, because without Montreal and Kunming, there is no chance of succeeding for Paris. But we should not fool ourselves. With international conferences and increased ambition, we cannot save the planet and effectively fight climate change. So first of all, it's implementation. It has to be global and horizontal. Before becoming commissioner responsible for environment, I was serving as a national minister of economy. And I can tell you that now, when I'm usually in the room full of ministers of environment, they all know what we're speaking about. They all know about the COP15 and the strategies that they need to implement. But when I enter the room of ministers responsible for economy, the picture is completely different. So it has to be horizontal and it has to be global. And we have to break this vicious circle of increasing ambition, meeting, being cheerful, and then returning in 10 years, realizing that we haven't achieved it. So coming to the EU actions, I think the most important is a Fit for 55. Fit for 55 package is the first one in the world that we have a very concrete steps of what we need to do to reach a minus 55% of CO2 emissions by 2030. This is a crucial step, a first step on that transition. We're finalizing that package with co-legislation. The most of it, it's already adopted. Yes, we have a climate law and a legal ambition to reach the minus 55 in 2030 and then fully decarbonize in 2050. But still, without a solid plan, all those goals means nothing. So Fit for 55 is definitely there. And then, of course, I'm extremely proud that we have our biodiversity strategy with a clear protection measures where we want to step up the protection of nature and allow the ecosystem to thrive, and also our nature restoration legislation, where we want to deploy a restoration efforts at 20% of ecosystems around the EU. And this is the only chance. If we have this picture complete, then we have a good chances of succeeding. If we only address a bit of emissions, I'm afraid we're still going to find ourselves running from fossil fuels-based crisis into materials extraction crisis, and we have to avoid that.
Thank you, Virginijus. I completely agree with your point that our ecosystems are important and they play a huge role with how the future of our climate will look like. And I think a key part of that is also air, the quality of our air, the pollution in our air, and I therefore turn to you, Jane. The Clean Air Fund website states that action on air pollution is also climate action. Could you elaborate on this?
Yes, thank you, of course. So action on air pollution is the same as action on climate change about 2/3 of the time, because about 2/3 of air pollution is actually from burning fossil fuels. So the problems often have the same sources and they can therefore have the same solutions. Renewable energy, clean public transport, more walking and cycling. And actually there's quite a strong link to the first question that you asked about what does effective and efficient climate action look like. Because why I started working on air quality is I used to work in the climate change department in the British government running climate and energy science. And I saw that there was a survey that the government ran and been running for about 15 years on public attitudes to climate change. And for that whole time that the survey was being run, at least 2/3 of the British public said that they were somewhat or very concerned about climate change. But then in my day job, when I looked at the data, the UK had managed to decarbonise the power sector very well, but all of the things that required individuals' behaviour change, especially transport, people changing their vehicles or driving less, emissions were going up, even though vehicles were becoming more efficient. So I was like, these two things don't really add up. People are, like, the vast majority of people are very concerned about climate change, but you know, the environment mustn't be right for people to make the right choice. So I think that creating the environment where climate-friendly choices are the easy choices is, for me, what efficient climate action looks like. And to Reto's point earlier about we need stories, I think that air quality does provide those stories. You know, everybody knows somebody who has asthma. Everybody can feel empathetic to the people who are suffering from the consequences of pollution, the health consequences. And so being able to connect those two things and say, you know, buying a cleaner vehicle or using your car less is actually really supporting people's health as well as helping the climate is the kind of story that we need to tell more of.
Thank you so much, Jane. You mentioned how there's some barriers to decarbonizing our industries. Among those, transport is an incredibly difficult one. Jim, I'm going to turn to you because you have served as the chairman of multiple companies who have radically reinvented their supply chains to a more climate-focused approach. Among those, I know you have experience also with transport industry. So in your experience, how are these transitions effectively mobilized?
Well, maybe let me start by saying that I've been really looking forward to this gathering. The other rooms I'm in this week have, you know, an average age significantly higher than this. And I truly believe that if we don't team up across generations, we cannot solve these problems. We need your optimism. We need your level of engagement. We need your creativity. And we need your binary approach. For me, this is getting binary. This is getting radical. We cannot continue with continuous improvement because it's just too slow. You know, when I was your age, I didn't know what climate was other than the temperature of the day. And I'm proud that you know and that you have a voice and that you take action. I grew up on Greenland. And I spent 7 years of my childhood in Greenland. And I was back this April. And on some days, it's supposed to be minus 20 degrees Celsius, and we had days with +5. And if all the ice on Greenland would melt, we're talking 6 to 7 meters higher oceans. So for me, this is like even getting personal. Now, I'm in these boardrooms with, you know, older people, and I'm arguing a radical approach. And yes, I have some experiences. And the good news is I think we are at an inflection point. We're at an inflection point where we need to challenge the assumption that we either do something good for shareholders or something good for the climate, and we need to balance these two. No, the technologies are so far now that if we dramatically change our minds and reinvent value chains with zero carbon, I argue it's a better business as well. And those companies who do that first will be the leaders of the next generation of industrialization, the one without carbon. I have a few experiences with that. I was the chairman of Maersk, the largest shipping company in the world. At Maersk, we transport 2 million containers every month and basically makes, you know, world trade happen, connecting people everywhere in the world with global markets, and with that create livelihood everywhere. Now it's a polluting industry. It's the least polluting way of moving goods, but the industry accounts for 9% of CO2 emissions. And we've been working hard on trying to reduce CO2 emissions by more efficient vessels and, you know, slow steaming, sailing slower, you know, but there is a limit to how far this incremental approach can get you. So in 2018, we took a bold move. We basically said, let's commit to zero carbon shipping. Now, you can do that in two ways. You sail so slow that you don't sail at all, and then you save it all. Or you have to actually get, you know, into innovation. You have to reinvent the vessel. Now, in 2018, when we made this decision, we had no idea how to do it, but we still made a commitment. And what happened was innovation. People coming together and finding the solution. We now know the solution. It's power to X, it's converting green electricity to green hydrogen, and then converting that to a green fuel. We've ordered the first vessel in 21. It will be delivered this year. Zero carbon vessel. We've since then ordered 19. And with that, we changed the world from assuming it's impossible to now we have created a market where we're in the market for 600,000 tons of green fuel. Ultimately, we are going to need 15 million tons of green fuel, and this will become the biggest business opportunity in that industry. So what I'm basically saying is that I need your urgency, I need your engagement and innovation to team up around this, because this is a moment for us to be radical. I'm kind of tired of people talking about climate. I'm also tired of people protesting against climate. And I'm a big friend of those who just roll up the sleeves and start doing. The technologies are there. We just need the leadership that has the courage to do it.
Thank you so much, Jim. I think a key word that you used is change. Change in our supply chains, change in our approach to climate action. I therefore want to touch on a quote of yours, Reto. In a recent article, you state, for a very long time, change was seen as a burden, but I think now it can be seen as an opportunity. I think this really reflects what Jim has just said, and could you maybe elaborate on what you mean by this and what it means for the future of climate action, possibly touching on your research and how that can be used as a tool for change?
Thanks. I mean, Jim has basically said most of the elements. I think the decarbonization has long been sort of seen as a left-green thing, as an expensive thing. So it was put in one corner, sort of the environmentalist corner, and therefore business was not on board. And I think that has changed in the last few years. It has changed for the private citizens. Now the electric car for many is cheaper, insulating your home is cheaper, solar panels make sense. So it becomes economically interesting for the individual, and it also becomes interesting for business, as you just pointed out. I mean, if you do nothing, then you're exposed to the direct risks of sea level rise, extreme events, and so on, but you're also exposed to what they call the indirect effects or risks, which is climate litigation. It could be carbon taxes, it could be regulations, it could be protests and shitstorms and whatever. And of course, many of the businesses, they see opportunities. So they see that they can make money with that. Jim has just mentioned the power to gas, power to X, and so on. There's plenty of things that actually economically make sense. It's cheaper to do an ambitious climate target than to do nothing. Or in other words, the most expensive thing is to do nothing. And I think that changes. The question is, how do we make it fast enough, and how do we scale it up fast enough? You mentioned 1 million tons of fuel. I mean, we're talking about scales for sequestration and synthetic fuel that are just enormous, right? So not just the research question, I can think, and that's the second part of your question, research can sort of provide an idea how the technology could work, but then we need something like Siemens to make it big. And that's something that a technical school cannot alone achieve. And sometimes it's actually now, I think, the bigger problem. How do you go from the liters to the million liters? But maybe Jim can comment.
Yeah, I'm happy to. I think this is, for me, the key. So I've been engaged with so many startups. There's enough fantastic ideas, everything from the hydrogen to the electric vehicles to the green batteries I'm now involved in, to minor, small cell, nuclear. We don't lack the innovation, the idea itself. We need scale, dramatic scale. And dramatic scale comes when you take the largest companies in the world and make them realize that this is a big opportunity. And then they have the courage to do this. It's almost like we need to reimagine value chains. I believe that this is a moment for big dreams. So we need the facts from the science, but then you need to dream big and then calculate backwards. So imagine we could have this conversation. How would this value chain look like with zero carbon, like we did with transportation? You can do that with all our value chains. And what needs to happen now so that we get there faster? And that's the scale problem. The scale is a lot of money, investments, but these are good investments. These have good returns. It's a lot of companies coming together and creating the infrastructures of the future. And that's why I truly believe it's not enough with startups. We need the big companies on board. We need to use their scale, their reach, and then this can happen much, much faster. When we made our commitment in 2018 at Maersk, we thought we would be done in 2050, and it sounded like a very difficult task. Last year, we moved it to 2040. And this is an industry where it can't be done, was the assumption. So 10 years ahead of the original impossible plan. Why not faster? It's up to us. And that's scale.
Thank you so much, Jim. And you're completely right. We need scale for climate action to be effective, to see results. And I don't think we can discuss climate action without talking about an event where, like you said, we can bring people together and ideas can come together, which is COP27. I therefore want to turn to you, Virginijus. You were an active member of the COP27 last year. Could you share your experience at such an event? And in your opinion, are the COPs themselves enough to bring people together and mobilize climate action on the scale that we need to see it?
So let me go into scale first, because I think what's extremely important and what you all have now, you know, in your hands is actually market and consumers. They can drive that scale, and we should never forget that. That if there is a market demand, and if consumers they have informed choices, we have done that with energy and efficiency, where a very simple label from A to F allowed Europeans to choose, you know, more energy efficient electronic devices, batteries, and so on. And very often, consumers went for A because they could easily calculate that in the long term it's a saving. So when market and consumers drive that change, of course it's easier for companies as well to scale. So you all have this power in your hands. Now returning back to COP27 and overall COPs, I think of course it's extremely important events which gathers first of all the players around the world. Less skeptical, more skeptical, ambitious, and they try to, you know, find this landing zone. It's not always an easy exercise, but I think in the end of the day that you manage to leave the room with an agreement and certain steps that's going to be implemented is of course extremely important. Nevertheless, those steps, they need to be implemented, and as I said, we need to break out of this vicious circle and put much more effort into implementation than into this sort of gathering, which again, it is important, but implementation is a key. And you know, that also if you want to have other actors on board, because for example, COP27, but COP15, which is, you know, biodiversity COP, is not as well known as climate COP, had enormous presence of businesses. And this is a key actors to be present, who can also drive this change. But for businesses to invest, to scale, they also need a clarity. So we can only give them clarity if we agree and then implement. Because if we don't follow through our words, there will be those who will be cutting corners. There will be those who may be willing to invest, but then they will see that there is a competitive advantage to the one who is cutting corners. So level playing field, the global implementation is extremely important. And COPs can be the, you know, the driver of those binding agreements.
Thank you so much, Virginijus. I think you are completely right. We need the people who are willing to, like Jim said, roll up their sleeves and implement what we need to see climate action. And you mentioned players at the COP27, and I think a key player was Namgay. Namgay, you attended the COP27 as a country negotiator for the Article 6 of the Paris Agreement. Could you elaborate on your work and why it's of significance?
I'll spend some time responding to, well, reacting to what I've heard so far. And I have 3 points, and I'll also try to bring elements of my work into it. So I'll start off with a rather incendiary statement that today I would urge all of you in this room to really reflect upon your privilege of, well, being young, but also being born in the most developed part of the world. And when it comes to the climate conversation, it's really amazing to hear about all the progress being made on the scientific front, on the corporate front, on the innovation front, and also in terms of the civil liberties that all of you have to be able to go out there and really engage yourselves in spaces where you're heard willingly by your leaders and your institutions. I want to point out the fact that for many, many parts of the world, this is not how it is. If I were to share my experience, I come from a country where almost half of the population comprises of people below the age of 29, but many young people feel that policymaking is just for policymakers, and by that I mean somebody old and somebody working in government. And there certainly is a disenfranchisement, okay, this is a difficult word, of young people from very important spaces of decision-making and of policy. And I've been privileged enough to be included in some of these spaces. And I often think to myself then, what do I do to share that privilege? I heard this amazing phrase yesterday where a friend of mine said that there are doors that we can walk through, but it's important that you hold that door so that someone less privileged than you can walk through it. So something that you can think about is, what are you doing in your position of privilege to make the conversation on climate more accessible to somebody who may not know about it, or for someone who lives in a different part of the world where this conversation is not a possibility. Second, in terms of, when we talk about scaling up of solutions, it makes me a little uncomfortable because I feel that we're always talking about, well, how do we make our supply chains greener, but then it's really about how do we then keep consuming without the negative environmental consequences. But I would also maybe make a suggestion that we really have to take a step back and look into our consumption patterns. Do we really need to keep consuming? What can we do to make our lifestyles more sustainable? And this is pertinent to the developed world because this is where most of the consumption happens, versus many parts around the world that is still emerging, that is still developing, where per capita emissions and also consumption rates are much, much smaller. And thank you. And finally, I also want to say that one of the most important things a young person can develop right now, and for all of you, because the world is really your oyster, is to develop empathy. And I want to ground this in the context of my experience at COP, because there's a lot of frustration around the political process, the multilateral process, because of the rate at which we are not achieving progress. And it's also very clear who are the parties that don't want progress there. And that is a huge debate in itself. But I feel that we could really use a lot more empathy for each other's plights. And, I'm not pitching this as a divide between the developed versus the developing world, because even among the different coalition blocks, there is a lot of disagreement. But at the end of the day, it's really about empathy. It's really about who are the most vulnerable, but who also have the least resources to adapt and mitigate to our changing climate. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Namgay, for your inspiring thoughts. And I think they can really resonate with a lot of our audience, who is mostly youth. I want to touch on the fact that you mentioned empathy and helping others. And I think a key part of doing that, especially in the field of climate, is philanthropy. So therefore, going back to you, Jane, I recently read that only 2% of philanthropic funds go to climate change. What can we do about that, given the urgency and scale of the problem, as well as the amount of funds needed?
You're right, yes. This report was out just a couple of weeks ago about this incredibly low amount of philanthropy that goes to climate change overall. I mean, the positive part was that it is increasing. There's lots of new donors coming into climate, and the ones that already exist have increased their donations significantly, but from quite a low base. So it remains at a very small percentage. I think one thing that we can do is increase the size of the pie, because this absolutely isn't about taking money away from other agendas. And the forum actually launched an initiative called Gaia yesterday, which is about doing exactly that. finding the initiatives that already exist that are able to scale, and working together to identify potential new initiatives that could be developed. But I think also it's about determining where we can identify shared agendas. Because these, when you draw the pie chart of philanthropic funding from which you can tell that there's 2% going to climate, it's not quite so clear-cut as that. The example of air quality shows that climate action can also have these massive health benefits. If you're reducing fossil burning, whether it's in transport or power or industry, then pollution comes down at the same time as greenhouse gases. And that has a huge benefit, saving lives and reducing asthma cases and all of the other health problems associated with air pollution. And it also then has economic development potential. If people are healthier, it costs less to the national health system, and it costs less to businesses because people can be more productive. They can come to work more because they're not so sick. There's also huge potential, you might be surprised, when you reduce air pollution for education, because children's brains and lungs, especially in parts of the world where it's incredibly polluted, are very affected by air pollution. And in some places it can get so polluted that they actually have to close the schools because it's too dangerous for the kids to go outside. So all of these different outcomes and different benefits are, you spend the climate change finance, but there's benefits for everything else. So I feel like if we identify more shared agendas across philanthropy and invest in the sorts of projects that have multiple benefits, then the money will go further.
Thank you so much. You touched on the opportunities and benefits that come from investing in climate action. I want to go back to you, Jim, because for many stakeholders, this radical reinvention and transitioning to a more climate-focused approach and focusing on climate action can come with sacrifice. It comes with a trade-off. So there's not only opportunities and benefits in a lot of cases. And the trade-off often is climate action for financial performance. How does this make you feel, and what are your suggestions for overcoming this trade-off?
I think it's a key question to ask, so thank you for that. And I do believe that if I go 10 years back, the trade-offs were significant. And the reasons were that the technologies were just not developed far enough, and so you had to be almost philanthropic to be doing these projects. And the approach of companies would be to do the business the normal way, which might be actually polluting the world, and then have a discussion, well, how much of our profit should we now use on doing good again for the world? I think we are at an inflection point now in history where the technologies have developed so far, and we've begun to get scale in some of these technologies where the trade-off is significantly lower. There's still a green premium, but in my mind, it's about scale. If we get enough scale, the green premium may convert to a green benefit. If I give you one example, I recently got involved with Northvolt, a battery production designed to be zero carbon and designed to be circular. So when you design for circularity, you design your battery in such a way that you can take it apart again when you recycle it, and you can reuse. If you take an average battery today, you probably reuse 40%. In this design, we reuse at least 95%, ideally everything. Now, the interesting thing on the trade-off is that when you do that recycling and you do the math at scale, the raw materials from the recycled battery is significantly cheaper than the raw materials you would have to dig out of the soil in a mine somewhere. And therefore, it becomes a green benefit, not a cost premium. And I see that happening in many, many industries. On energy, solar and wind is now cheaper than coal. So you have to be stupid to invest in more coal. You only do that because the infrastructure is not ready for the chaos that happens in a sustainable or renewable energy system. So that's where we have to invest. If you go to the battery, as I said, the battery produced, a recycled battery, is cheaper than the one not. If you go to train systems or manufacturing locations or buildings, we can make them 100% carbon neutral, and it means you save a lot of energy costs. So I think if we are at a moment in history now where the trade-offs disappear, and it's almost like we need a mindset change, because we go into these conversations assuming, oh, it's going to be more expensive. I think it's going to be cheaper. I think it's going to be better. And if you have that mindset, you dare to dream big. You dare to invest in that future. So that is now we still have some green premium prices, and therefore I am going to this meeting trying to inspire business leaders to have the courage, because without that we don't get to that zero premium price. But the trade-off today is small, and I often remind people that the Stone Age didn't end because we ran out of stone. And the fossil era will not end because we run out of fossil fuels. It ends because there is a better alternative, not just from a climate environment point of view, but also from a cost and business case point of view. That's the inflection point we're at right now, and that's why I'm arguing let's roll up the sleeves and just do it.
Thank you so much, Jim. Like he said, a lot of people that are rolling up our sleeves are us, the people in the audience, the people attending the open forum. And I would therefore like to thank our esteemed panel for such an insightful conversation so far. And now we're going to turn to you, the audience, for the Q&A portion of this session. So if you have a question, please raise your hand and we'll do our best to pass the microphone to you. Please state your name and keep your question as brief as possible, addressing a specific panelist if possible. And I'd also like to say that if you wish to ask your question in German, you absolutely may. We have translation here, so English or German both work. So if anyone has a question, please go ahead. Yes, right here.
You mentioned earlier that one of the key steps is getting big companies to agree to move forward on these climate initiatives. And I was wondering, what's a step that youth can do to get directly involved in talking to these large companies and helping them implement large action in terms of like persuading and starting conversations with these large companies?
Are you addressing me? I presume. Okay. So the reason I'm so excited about this conversation is that I believe that the big ideas come from young people. Old idiots like me, we have too many assumptions. And assumptions build over time because you see things and then you assume it's like that. And you don't have those limitations. So I think the biggest thing you can do is the breadth and depth of ideas. I don't think the protest helps a lot. It creates distance. But what about this conversation around what can we do? What can we do together? And I have an idea. Can I try it out in your company, or can you help fund my idea so that we can get going? That is my wish list, if any, that if you take your ideas and your energy and bring them into the corporate world, maybe we can do something at scale together much faster. Instead of building, walls between us, let's collaborate and do it faster.
Virginijus, would you like to add?
If I may add a couple words. So, first of all, protest helps because there would be no Green Deal without the Fridays for Future. That was those people who went every Friday on the street, who were clear and loud, and politicians were forced to act. You could not ignore them. It was great timing, and that's why we have a Green Deal with all 3 years of implementation and really very much advancing on it. So it was all achieved by you and people like you who cared. Now, how can you form and help form, so that the big companies also move? As I said, one of the things which is very important is your consumption pattern. How much you consume, what you buy, what you choose, what you promote, and etc. And you have really powerful tools now in your hands, even in your pockets, which allows you to be connected to the whole world. And that can help a lot. Look at so many companies involved in greenwashing. They're doing because they want to attract people like you. They want you on board. So I think you speaking out very directly to those who involved in greenwashing and sidelining them and not having any business with them will help a lot. Another thing, at some point you will end up in those companies. You will work with them, you will lead them, and you know, your knowledge, your ideas will be very much welcome. And if you, as you know, greatest talent pool, the most brightest students that we have around Europe, you will choose one company because it has a very clear values and it cares not only about tomorrow's profit, but actually about, you know, long-term planet. That will also help very much to shape the company's choices.
Thank you so much, both of you, for your insightful remarks. Are there any other audience questions? Yes, right there.
Mein Name ist Urs Hermann.
My name is Urs Hermann. As far as I heard, you are carriers of hope. Can you give me an indication in how far the population growth of the world has an influence on the climate? Second question, are there at least in the laboratory a proof that our measures work? And third question, it is very fast that the climate is changing and the temperature increasing. What is your hope? Thank you.
So maybe I can is the mic on? Yeah. Maybe I can answer the question on population. This is something that often, unfortunately, often comes up. Of course, more people use more resources. That's obvious. But if you look at how population evolves, basically much of what we're seeing in the next decades is what's already in the system. It's the fact that we have a lot of young people and very few older ones, and if you want to go to an equilibrium, then you need to sort of come from this triangle to something that is more square. So most of it is just unavoidable. The only thing we can really do is to help education and access to medical resources in the developing world. That's basically what we can do. I mean, we cannot control how many kids people have, but the most obvious point is if you want to get to net zero, then everybody has to go to zero. So just by reducing a bit or reducing population a bit is not going to solve it. I think you solve it by producing clean energy, and as we just discussed, it works. It's a question of doing it.
Jane, would you like to add?
Yeah, I was going to come in on the other two questions. The one about, are there any proof that the measures, climate actions work, and what's our hope given that temperatures are increasing so quickly? So yes, there's lots of proof that that climate actions can work. These solutions, as Jim has said, exist. They're being implemented. They're in lots of places around the world. And so we have seen the effect of them in tipping greenhouse gases down in many places. For some actions, like activism, there is also proof that the measures work. You know, you've just heard from the Commissioner that Fridays for the Future is one of the reasons that Europe committed to very strong targets. So, you know, working in philanthropy, we're always trying to look at not just the implementation of the technology, but all of the actions that need to happen to create the political will to make those technologies be implemented or create the policy environment in which they're implemented and financed. And there's a reasonable amount of evidence that for many of these technologies, the activism works, that people can really affect change by pushing politicians and businesses to do more. And so coming on to hope, that's really what gives me hope. We work with everybody from parents groups in Poland who managed to push for a domestic coal-burning ban, which is coming into force this year in Warsaw, to doctors in India that are highlighting the health harms of fossil fuel pollution. And there's really inspiring individuals that there's a lot of evidence their actions are affecting change.
Thank you so much. And I think it's clear that if we all work together, the individuals in the audience and organizations, that we can, like you said, see true change. Are there any other questions? Yes, right here.
Thank you. My name is Nisha, and my question's for you, Jane. So you touched upon vehicles. So I was wondering if you could talk a bit about the ULEZ zone and whether it will be extended or potentially be extended outside of London. Thank you.
Thank you. Great question. So for those who don't know, the ULEZ is in London low emission zone, ultra low emission zone. And it started off just being the centre of London, and then it got expanded once, and the Mayor of London is now consulting on expanding it to cover the whole of London, so 10 million people. It's a very bold policy move, and the way that it works is charging for the most polluting vehicles to enter the city centre. I do believe that it will be extended. I mean, there's a very large package. You've got to always think about having a good balance of carrot and stick, and the charge for the polluting vehicles is the stick, but there's quite a lot of carrot in the package as well. There's subsidies for people who absolutely have to drive a vehicle, disabled people, charities, small businesses. There's a subsidy for them to either buy a new electric vehicle or retrofit their existing one. And there's also a lot of additional finance for new bus routes, because this extra area that they're thinking of expanding the zone to has less good public transport than the central area. And so it needs more public transport to enable people to leave their car at home and get on public transport. And then I think the final reason why it's likely to happen is what we know in London from evidence that the Mayor and not-for-profits have put together, is that it's the lowest income families and individuals that are the least likely to have a car and the most likely to be exposed to pollution. Namgay was mentioning this kind of inequitability in both who's exposed and who's exposed to the policies. So people recognise that in London now. I don't know whether you all have heard of a campaigner called Rosamund Kissy Deborah. Very tragically, her daughter died aged 9 from an asthma attack that was brought on by air pollution. And she has been a main advocate for this ultra-low emission zone. And to Reto's point from earlier about needing stories, her very tragic story and that of her family has really inspired a huge amount more action than I think would have happened otherwise in London, and is the reason that it's likely to go ahead.
Thank you so much, Jane. Are there any other questions from the audience? Yes, back there.
Very much. My name is Michael. I was wondering if we could discuss the role of what we eat in addressing the climate crisis. Obviously, people like to eat a lot of meat and have gigantic ranches, and this can drive things. So the role of diets that are plant-based, perhaps even edible insects or vegan in nature, what role that can play, and how states, businesses, and nonprofits can encourage those kinds of diets.
I'm happy to give my input on that. I think it's a key element. So what I did for myself is I sat down and used some of the research to figure out where are the biggest problems. It's not just in transportation or in energy or in manufacturing or in cities. It's also food. Food systems account for around 21% of CO2 emissions, and they are unhealthy. And they have a lot of waste, 40%. So here we have a system where if we reinvent that, we would have zero carbon, we would have healthier being, and we would have no waste, which means there's plenty of food for all 8 billion people in this world. So it's a very important point that you are addressing. My daughter, 24, inspired me and said, Dad, how can you advocate for these zero carbon value chains if you still eat meat? And so I stopped eating meat. Now the math would say, well, you need to stop eating meat 11 years to compensate for a flight to Thailand. Yes, but if 1 billion people stop eating meat, I tell you it has a big impact. Not only does it have a big impact on the current food system, but it will also inspire innovation of food systems. And I predict that we will have proteins not coming from meat in the future. They will probably taste even better. So why are we trying to mimic meat if we can have a better taste? They will be zero carbon and much healthier than the kind of food that we eat today. That is a mission that we need to get on. I can inspire you to maybe look at an organization called EAT, easy to remember, EAT, who have all the facts on this and who have the policies necessary, the innovations necessary, and the scale necessary in order to make food systems sustainable and healthy.
Thank you so much, Jim. And you're right, EAT is really a great foundation. You should all really look it up and if you have time. I think we have time for one more audience question. So, yes, right there in the middle.
Yes, my name is Eros, and I've got a question about consumption in general and in the private household. And that is, Mr. Snabe, you mentioned creating sustainable energy is very important to have access to new and greener energy, right? And Ms. Choden, you also mentioned the consumptional part. And I believe that consumption is the biggest role for having a healthier planet, a greener planet. And that's why I want to ask you if there's any projects to reduce consumption in general.
So I can maybe give my thought on that. So there was an equation once, the iPad equation. I, with the impact on the environment, equals P, which is the population, times A, which is affluence, so consumption per capita, times T. Every time we add technology, we pollute more. Now you look at these three factors, P, A, and T. We either have no people, the problem is zero, no consumption, we will also go to zero because we multiply, or no technology. And I'm like, which one of these factors are we going to reduce? Population, in my life has more than doubled. Affluence is 10 times bigger, average consumption, and we use more technology than ever before. I think the only way to solve this is not by reducing consumption. I think it's naive to believe we can, because people do want to consume. But what if we could make consumption have zero climate impact? i.e. take the T in this equation and divide by T, not multiply by T. Use technology in ways that makes it possible to be people that consume with zero impact on the planet. I think it's possible. But then we have to imagine different consumption systems, different value chains. I think they're possible.
I'll add on to that as well by posing a question, really, because sometimes when it comes to consumption, it's not really demand-driven, but rather supply-driven. Mm-hmm. So there are these producers, manufacturers, and companies that make you want to consume more. For instance, fast fashion, for example. A long time ago, you would buy clothes like 5 times a year, probably one piece. It would probably be well made, would last you for a lifetime, maybe even pass it down to your children. And then you have the fast fashion cycle that, well, changes now at such an unbelievable rate. Literally every day you have these new products coming up on these websites. So I would say it's not really fair at times to place the entire onus of responsibility on the consumption itself, because there are these very, for the lack of better words, high-level manipulation that's going on. And again, it's really about holding these practices accountable. And but at the same time, as I said before, this is not to negate individual action, because as you said, Jim, if 1 billion people started doing it, then we reach that mass mobilization that can really truly bring change.
Thank you so much. And I think you're both right. A mix of accountability, yet also individual action is exactly what we need for efficient climate action. Unfortunately, that concludes our time for the Q&A. I would like to thank you, members of the audience, as well as our panelists, for making this a truly meaningful discussion. To close our session, I would like to ask each panelist to share one brief climate action each audience member can take when you exit these doors today? Reto, would you like to start?
I mean, there's lots of things you can do individually, whether you drive a car or not, what you eat and so on. But I mentioned before, we've never solved any of those environmental problems by individual action alone. If you think about waste, air pollution, ozone, even the pandemic, we've solved it by some kind of system, political system. So engage with politics, especially in Switzerland. We decide how this country works. And if we get the young generation involved, I think we can drive the political system forward.
Thank you. Namgay, would you like to continue?
The climate crisis sometimes seems so far away and abstract because you think that it's happening not here, but somewhere really far, far away. But I think all of us realize that climate change is fundamentally going to change your economic opportunities, the way you live in your cities, and the food you eat, and so on. So I would really, what you said really resonates with me. I think meaningful participation means placing yourselves in places of decision-making and policy-making. So that's running for office, but it's also public service, working in government, where you are going to be committed to driving these long-lasting policy changes. And finally, I would like to also end by saying that it's far more better to act and be than just to seem. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Namgay. Jim, would you like to continue?
Yeah, so I just want to inspire you by saying that we are lucky to be living in this time in history when we have the opportunity to create a sustainable future. And I have two advice, which actually come from my children, who I'm super proud of. I already told you the advice of my daughter, who is creating circular systems, so I'm super proud of her. And she said, stop eating meat. And my second advice is from my son. He decided to work in private equity, investing in sustainable startups. So choose wisely where you work. Mm-hmm. You know, do you want to, if you're in tech, work in a company that steals people's data and makes consumption in advertising or fake news, or do you want to work with a company like Siemens, who actually tries to make infrastructure sustainable? Make your choice. And I have an ask, which is my last plea. I would like to take a picture of you, and I would like those of you who believe we can do this and stay within the 1.5 degrees to raise your hand as I take the picture, if I may. I need you to believe in this. Yes. You made my day. Thank you very much. Believe in this, okay?
Thank you so much, Jim. Virginijus, would you like to?
So, you know, first of all, individual actions matters, and I would like to probably pick up from that last question, because it was about the consumption. So those choices matter a lot, and I think for us as a policymakers, we have to ensure that you have fully informed choices. So you have a choice, and you know if you're buying a product which will last 7 years or 20 years or so, can it be repaired and etc. But also at the end of the day, your choices will matter, and that can you know, drive a change. So never underestimate individual power. Fridays for Future, all that movements and so on, it sometimes started from a very determined person who just came to the parliament holding a cardboard written that, you know, take a climate action. So never underestimate yourself, and then you can get enormous backing and policymakers acting.
Thank you. Jane, would you like to conclude our discussion?
Yeah, I would say make your voice heard in whichever way is appropriate for you. If that might be activism and protest, it might be advocacy in where you work or where you go to school or college, or even with your parents about what they do and what they buy. And you know, come to sessions that aren't about climate change and ask the companies on the panel what they're doing. Just try and make your voice heard, keep raising your concern about climate change, because it really is having an impact.
Amazing. Again, a special thank you to our panelists and the Open Forum team for facilitating this session. As we've heard today, please remember that every single one of you plays a key role in mobilizing not only yourself, but your community and beyond for climate action. I wish you all a wonderful day and enjoy the rest of your time in Davos.